law, in essence, exempts wind power in these expedited areas of the state of Maine, which in essence is about half of the state of Maine. All of the western mountains and all of the northeastern uplands are all part of an expedited area for wind power development. And in those areas, essentially, the wind industry is given carte blanche to go in and do whatever they need to do, regardless of its impact on the environment. And citizens' input to the process of siting and determining where these things are going to go, or even whether or not they're a good thing, have been severely curtailed. The reason why I got involved was that the very first project under this expedited wind permitting process was the Rollins project in Lincoln Lakes. And I was born and raised in Lincoln and still vacation up there. And so I got involved in that, and we discovered that, well, there was already this project up in Mars Hill, and one that had started to go in Stetson Mountain at the time.
Right.
And then there was the second project to come under the expedited wind was Record Hill in Roxbury. So I talked with the folks up in Mars Hill, discovered that, a lot of the folks down in town thought they were a great thing. The wind power company had come in and promised them practically a green utopia by destroying the top of Mars Hill Mountain. But if you went up to East Ridge Road and Mountain Road, where people were severely impacted by this, it was a completely different story. And I talked with a fellow by the name of Steve Thurston from Roxbury Pond about the Record Hill project, and that was the beginning of putting together the Citizens Task Force on Wind Power. And it has been a long, frustrating experience in the last 4 years because everything is rigged in favor of this industry. And in my 63 years of life here in the state of Maine, I have never seen anything like it. The favoritism that pandering politicians, or in many cases, politicians who just said, oh, well, this sounds good because it's green. What's bad about wind power? They didn't know that this heinous law was put into place. So we tried in the last session of the legislature to bring about changes in the law. We had 14 bills that were introduced to the legislature. They all went to the Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee and were voted ought not to pass on every single one of them because the committee was controlled by people who are very favorable to influence from the wind lobby.
Okay. What can people do to assist your organization, if anything?
Well, there's a lot of things to do. The wind industry depends on tax subsidies. And one of the issues in Congress right now, and it's not too late to have some influence because this has not been decided, is the renewal of the production tax credit. The production tax credit is 2.2 cents per kilowatt hour on top of what a wind developer can sell the output in the wholesale market or the auction market for actual wind production.
So explain that. So the wind power is generated, and what happens to it? It goes to the grid?
Well, it has to go into the grid.
And it's sold to the grid?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so they get the auction price. The ISO New England, which is the grid operator, does an annual, a daily auction to determine for the next day where their power supply is going to come from, and what the price of that is going to be. And so that generally has been kept very low because of the low cost of natural gas-fired electrical generation. So wind can pick up whatever the cost is in the auction. They're not part of the planning for baseload, or what we call baseload following production that ISO New England knows is predictable. What hums along at 24/7 as a demand on the grid is called baseload power. And then, the grid operators know that come 6 o'clock in the morning, they start to see an increase in power demand. People are waking up, putting on lights, the coffee pots come on. Right. Yeah, right. We're thinking along the same lines there. But they have so much experience with it that they can practically predict hour to hour what their demands are going to be.
Sure.
And wind power is just considered surplus because by law they also have to plan on having surplus. Mm-hmm. If a major problem happens at one of the large generators and they have to curtail their power, you have to have the surplus that you can then call on.
Right.
Again, getting
Hopefully
back to
wind will be working or operating at that time.
Well, maybe not.
Right.
But you also always have that oil-fired plant over there on Cousins Island, just sitting hot, ready to get the call from ISO New England saying, help.
Right.
So wind gets to participate in those revenues, and then it gets the production tax credit on top of that. If the wind producer has not received Section 1603 funding from the American Recovery Act, because if they took that, then they don't participate any further in production tax credit. But then the wind side operator also gets to take those same electrons that they might produce and sell them as renewable energy certificates. And do you remember Enron?
Yes.
And you remember that Enron didn't have the best business ethics?
Gee, no. I something about that, yeah.
Well, I always refer to renewable energy certificates as an Enron-inspired scam.
Oh, geez. Now, what are these certificates? Tell us.
Well, these are called RECs for short. So a renewable energy certificate is just saying we are producing from a renewable source of power X amount of megawatts. And they go into an auction, and for the most part, sometimes there are do-gooder organizations, and particularly universities that want to be perceived as green, will buy them so that they can say, we have a green campus because we're offsetting the emissions from our gas-fired steam plant that operates campus by buying these renewable energy certificates. But RECs are also very popular with companies that own and operate coal-fired plants because they're allowed to offset their emissions by buying RECs.
Oh, this game.
So the theoretical production of wind turbines out in the remote part of the state of Maine ends up offsetting the pollution of coal-fired plants out in the Ohio Valley. So we still get all the air pollution that comes from the Midwest.
But they don't get any of the energy that the wind mill is making, right?
Right. It's all theoretical.
It's just a piece of paper.
Yeah. That's why it's a scam.
Oh, you're kidding me.
An Enron-inspired scam.
Oh,
and I like to pick on Enron because the wind industry is the bastard son of Enron.
Okay, that's pretty direct.
And I say that because the wind industry starts with Enron. Enron Wind bought up Zephyr Wind, which was one of the few leading companies that were dabbling in producing utility-scale wind back in the 1990s. And Enron was responsible for the first enactment in the state of Texas, where they were located, of a renewable portfolio standard known as an RPS. And with an RPS, they convince the legislature in Texas, and this has been replicated in more than half of the states now, including every state in the Northeast, that it was good public policy for some reason to say that your electrical utilities had to have a certain percentage of so-called renewable energy by a certain date. So here's what the problem with that is. Wind power, solar power are two of the very most expensive forms of generating electricity. Solar has no impact here in the state of Maine, so I'll continue focused on wind. Here in the Northeast, you essentially have three forms of renewable energy. You have wind power, you have locally produced biomass, and locally produced hydro. And then across the border, you have a massive amount of hydroelectric power from Hydro-Quebec and particularly the Churchill Falls project up in Newfoundland in Labrador is the world's second largest hydroelectric power project. And they would love to sell that electricity to the United States.
But they can't.
Because another problem with renewables is, and here in the state of Maine, our governor tried to get this changed in the last legislature. We have a law that says that hydroelectric sources of more than 100 megawatts are not allowable.
Why?
In order to help foster the development of wind power.
Oh, so we're doing away with one in order to bring upon another that is not nearly as equal.
Yeah. You have a very dependable source of hydropower that is being replaced by an unpredictable, unreliable, non-dispatchable, far more costly form of energy generation with wind power.
It doesn't make any sense. Why would anybody do this?
They're pandering politicians to a very well-structured, well-financed lobby representing an industry that shouldn't exist. The wind power industry could not compete economically on its own.
No, they couldn't, which is why it hasn't sprung up until subsidies were brought into the
subsidies and mandates.
Right.
Because that's the problem with the RPS is its mandates. I happen to be somewhat of a libertarian bent in my philosophy in life. Don't tell me that I have to buy more expensive electricity than is necessary just because there's ideologically driven laws that mandate Central Maine Power Company to buy more expensive wind power.
Right. Agreed. Okay, let's talk about the future. We currently don't like wind for many reasons, but one of them is because we can't really store the energy right away. We can't have it run around and move the blade, and then when it stops, store the energy to be used at a later date. So is wind ever going to be good once we can get those storage facilities in place?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball,